Have you ever heard a sound so haunting, so chilling, that it felt as if the world itself held its breath? Tonight, we travel back to the dark heart of Alabama in the year 1861, where whispers of something unnatural began to spread through the swamps and plantations. A baby was born into bondage, but it was no ordinary child. Those who heard its cry claimed it brought death, and not just by coincidence. The doctors couldn't explain it. The preachers couldn't pray it away. Even the masters who ruled with iron and fire trembled when the wind carried that sound through the cotton fields. What was this cry that silenced the night? What power could it hold over the living? The air was thick that night in 1861 Alabama, heavy with rain and tension, the kind of night when even the wind seemed to whisper warnings through the cypress trees. The Montgomery plantation sat deep in the swamplands, where the ground bled mud and the cries of whip-poor-wills echoed like mourners for the living. The overseers had gone to their quarters, the fields were silent, and only the faint flicker of lamplight in the slave cabins broke the darkness. Inside one of those cabins, a woman named Ruth lay on a straw bed soaked in sweat and tears. She was a field slave, quiet, known for never speaking unless spoken to, but tonight her silence was broken by the agony of childbirth. Around her, a few of the older women gathered, their hands trembling as they tried to help her bring the child into a world that had never been kind to any of them. They whispered prayers, not to the Christian God their masters forced upon them, but to something older, something from the blood and the soil they carried in their bones. The storm outside roared, lightning cutting across the sky like a blade, and every flash made the women jump. They said Ruth's child was cursed, that strange things had followed her pregnancy from the start. She had not been touched by any man on the plantation, not that anyone had seen. Her belly had begun to swell after a night when the sky burned green, and a shadow had been seen standing by her cabin, though no one could say who or what it was. Even the overseer, a cruel man named Briggs, had ordered the others to stay away from her after one of his hounds had gone mad barking at her door, only to drop dead the next morning. Ruth said little, only that she dreamed of a storm, of a voice that told her her child would not be born to live as a slave. But she never explained what that meant, and no one dared to ask. As her labor grew harder, the air in the cabin began to feel strange, as if all the oxygen was being drawn out. One of the women said it felt like the air before a lightning strike, that prickling weight that crawls across the skin. Ruth's eyes rolled white, her fingers clutching at the rough blanket as thunder shook the floorboards. Then, without warning, the oil lamp flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The women screamed, fumbling to relight it, but when the flame finally returned, they saw Ruth holding the newborn in her arms. It was silent, no crying, no movement. Its skin was pale, not like theirs, not like any they had ever seen, almost translucent under the flickering light. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then Ruth whispered something no one could understand, and the baby let out a sound that froze the blood in every person there. It wasn't a normal cry. It wasn't the thin wail of a child taking its first breath. It was deeper, hollow, vibrating through the walls and into the ground itself. The candle flame bent backward as if pushed by wind, though there was none, and somewhere outside, the horses began to scream in their stalls. One of the women dropped to her knees, clutching her chest, whispering that it was the sound of crossing, the cry of something that had come from beyond and brought something back with it. Ruth only stared at her baby, rocking it slowly, her eyes filled not with fear, but a strange calm, as if she had been expecting this all along. By dawn, the rain had stopped, and the sun rose red over the plantation, casting everything in the color of blood. The overseer Briggs was found dead in his cabin, his face twisted in terror, eyes wide open, blood trickling from his ears. The doctor who examined him said it looked as though his brain had burst inside his skull, as if from some unseen pressure. No one could explain it. He was a strong man, healthy, cruel, but never ill. Yet there was no sign of struggle, no wound. Just that look, that horror, frozen forever on his face. When the news reached the slave quarters, no one spoke for a long time. The older women exchanged glances, their faces pale. They remembered the stories their mothers told them back in the old country, stories of spirits born when pain and injustice mixed with the rage of the dead. Ruth never cried for Briggs. She sat outside her cabin, holding her baby, staring into the distance. The others kept their distance too. Some said when she looked at you, her eyes seemed to reflect things that weren't there, flashes of faces, shadows moving just behind you. And the baby never cried again that day. It just looked around, its dark, glassy eyes too knowing, too old. The plantation master, a man named Whitfield, heard of the overseer's death and rode out himself. Furious that superstition was spreading among his slaves, he demanded to see the child. But when he entered the cabin and looked at it, he stumbled back, pale and trembling, muttering that the thing had eyes like mirrors. That night, a wind swept across the fields, carrying the faint sound of a baby crying again. Some said it came from the swamps, others swore it came from the sky. But when morning came, 2 more men were dead, their hearts stopped in their sleep. From that night on, no one on the plantation dared to go near Ruth's cabin after dark. The masters locked their doors tight. The slaves prayed quietly, but not for salvation. They prayed that whatever power had come into the world with that baby would pass them by, and as the thunder rolled again, the wind carried that cry once more, low, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the endless Alabama night. As the days turned into weeks after the overseer's death, fear began to settle over the plantation like a sickness that no one could cure. The fields once filled with the sounds of labor fell eerily quiet. The slaves worked slower, their eyes darting toward Ruth's cabin whenever the wind rustled through the trees. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. They said the baby could stop a man's heart with just one cry. They said its shadow didn't match its body, that sometimes it moved, even when the child was still. The masters laughed at such talk, but their laughter never reached their eyes. Even they began to notice the strange quiet that hung over the place, the way the air felt heavy near Ruth's quarters, as if every sound was swallowed by something unseen. By the second week, word of the strange birth had spread beyond the plantation. Travelers passing through Alabama whispered about it in taverns, describing it as a tale of witchcraft, of a slave woman who had birthed something neither human nor spirit. A local preacher came uninvited, insisting that the child be baptized, but when he stepped into the cabin and saw Ruth rocking the baby, his face turned gray. He said nothing, just turned and left, muttering prayers under his breath. Even the animals seemed to sense it. Dogs refused to go near Ruth's door, and the horses would whinny and thrash in their stalls whenever the baby cried. The plantation doctor, a man named Alden, was finally sent for. He arrived from Montgomery, skeptical and dismissive of all the talk. He was a man of science, proud of his education, convinced that every mystery could be measured, every fear explained. He entered Ruth's cabin with his medical bag and a notebook, ready to prove everyone wrong. Ruth sat silently, her baby cradled in her arms, its small face calm, its eyes following him with an unnatural stillness. Alden examined the child. Its heartbeat was faint, irregular, sometimes vanishing entirely for long stretches before returning as if nothing had happened. Its skin was cool, almost cold to the touch, and its pulse didn't quicken when he pressed against its chest. The doctor frowned, took notes, and decided to listen to its breathing. That was when he noticed it. There was no breath, no rise or fall of the chest, yet the baby blinked and moved. He sat back, shaken but trying to hide it, telling Ruth that he would return with better instruments. But as he turned to leave, the baby began to cry. The sound was soft at first, then rose higher, sharper, vibrating through the air, like the ringing of unseen glass. The lamp flame fluttered wildly, and Alden clutched his head, staggering as blood trickled from his nose. He stumbled out of the cabin, gasping for air, his eyes wide in disbelief. The next morning, his horse was found wandering alone by the road. Alden's body was discovered near the creek, his eyes open, his face frozen in horror, his ears bleeding just like the overseer's. After that, no one from town dared to come near. The master, Whitfield, began to lose his composure. His profits were falling, his workers terrified, and the sense that something invisible stalked his land kept him awake at night. He accused Ruth of witchcraft, threatening to have her whipped or burned, but when he tried to order his men to seize her, none would step forward. They said they saw shadows moving in the cabin windows, tall shapes that weren't Ruth or the baby. Some claimed to hear whispering from the walls, voices that spoke in tongues older than English. Whitfield's rage turned to fear. He locked himself in the big house, clutching his rifle and praying to a God who seemed not to hear. Meanwhile, Ruth stayed silent through it all. She didn't plead, didn't protest, didn't even cry. She sat with her child, her eyes distant, as though she saw something beyond the world around her. The other women brought her food in secret, but none would step inside the cabin. One said she saw the baby's reflection in a bowl of water even though the baby wasn't near it. Another swore that one night she heard two sets of breathing from within the cabin, one soft and human, the other low and rasping like wind passing through hollow wood. Days bled into nights, and the air grew thicker, charged with dread. When storms came, the baby cried again. Each time, something happened. A man's heart stopped while he slept. A horse broke its leg in the dark. A child's fever took her before morning. There was no pattern, no reason, yet everyone felt it, the connection between that unearthly cry and the mounting deaths. Even the white men began to avoid the fields after dusk. They said the shadows stretched wrong there, that sometimes the trees seemed to breathe. Whitfield tried to bury his fear under control. He gathered his men, armed them, and ordered Ruth's cabin surrounded one night. He said he would end it himself, prove that it was all madness and rumor. But when they approached the door, a wind began to rise, not from the sky, but from the ground. The torches flickered, and a strange humming filled the air, like the sound of bees trapped inside their skulls. One man screamed and dropped to his knees, covering his ears, his face bleeding. The others ran. Whitfield stood frozen, staring into the dark cabin where two eyes glowed faintly back at him, reflecting his torchlight like mirrors. He turned and fled without a word, locking himself away once more. The following days blurred together. The cotton fields lay untouched, and the air carried a constant tension, as though the land itself was waiting for something. Even the sun seemed dimmer, the mornings grey and muted. The slaves whispered that the child wasn't a curse but a reckoning, that it carried the pain of generations, that its cry was the voice of all those who had died without justice. The masters called it madness, but they too began to age faster, their eyes hollow, their hands shaking. The doctor's report was burned. No priest would come, and each night when thunder rolled in the distance, everyone prayed that the baby would stay silent, that the cry that summoned death would not rise again from that lonely, rotting cabin deep in the heart of Alabama. Among the enslaved on Whitfield's plantation, whispers grew into legends before the month was out. They spoke of the baby in the cabin who had never taken a full breath but somehow lived, whose cry brought death and whose silence felt heavier than thunder. The elders said they had heard stories like this long before they were taken from their homelands, stories of children born under omens, red moons, eclipses, storms that howled like the dead. They said such births meant the veil between the living and the spirits had thinned, and sometimes something crossed through. Many of them began to avoid the path that led to Ruth's door, leaving food and water a few yards away, bowing their heads when they passed. Yet there were still those who remembered Ruth before all this, remembered her kindness, the way she hummed lullabies at night to calm others, even when her own heart must have been breaking. They pitied her, but fear outweighed pity. Some of the older women whispered that Ruth's child was the result of something called the crossing. It was an old belief, carried from their ancestors across the ocean, that when pain and injustice reached a certain point, the spirits of the murdered and forgotten sought a vessel, a body through which to speak, to avenge, to remember. Those spirits did not choose freely. They were drawn to suffering, and no one had suffered like Ruth. Her body bore scars from the whip, her soul from years of watching her loved ones sold, buried, and beaten. When she was taken by fever months before the birth, she had lain on the edge of death for 3 days, and they said her eyes rolled back white the whole time. When she awoke, she said she had dreamed of a dark river filled with faces, and heard a voice promising that her pain would not be in vain. After the baby came, Ruth spoke rarely. When she did, her voice sounded distant, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. Once, one of the younger girls dared to ask her what she had dreamed while she was sick. Ruth looked at her for a long time, then said, "The river doesn't forget." The girl never asked again. The air around Ruth's cabin felt wrong, as though the world itself bent slightly around it. Flowers that grew near her door turned grey before they bloomed. The ground stayed damp even in sunlight. The others began to say that the earth refused to take anything from that place. Not roots, not seeds, not life. One night, a woman named Mabel crept to Ruth's cabin. She had lost her child years ago and thought perhaps she could help, or at least see the baby for herself. She opened the door quietly and found Ruth sitting by the cradle, humming softly. The baby was awake, its dark eyes gleaming in the low lamplight. Mabel said later that she felt cold the moment she crossed the threshold, as though she had stepped underwater. Ruth looked up, but her expression didn't change. The baby blinked, and Mabel swore she saw its reflection in the lamp glass, even though it wasn't close enough to cast one. She backed out slowly, whispering a prayer, and didn't sleep for 3 nights after. She said that every time she closed her eyes, she could hear a faint heartbeat, not her own, pulsing in her ears. The deaths continued. A field hand was found dead under a tree with no mark on him. A child fell from a hayloft, though no one saw her climb it. The white men blamed poison, exhaustion, sin, anything but what everyone knew deep down. Some of the enslaved began to think Ruth was no longer truly Ruth, that whatever spoke through her was not of this world. One day, she appeared at the edge of the fields, her baby in her arms, watching silently as the others worked. No one spoke to her. Even the wind seemed to die when she stood there. The master's son, a cruel young man named Thomas, rode past and spat near her feet, calling her a witch, a devil's wench. Ruth didn't flinch. But later that night, Thomas's horse returned to the stables without him, its mane matted with mud and its eyes wild with terror. His body was found by the river, face down, though there were no signs of drowning. His skin was cold, his heart burst. By then, no one doubted anymore that the baby's cry was connected to death, but they also began to notice something else. Each time someone died, the baby seemed stronger. It opened its eyes wider, it moved more. Its once faint heartbeat became louder. The old women said it was feeding, not on flesh or blood, but on the release of souls, taking the energy of the dead into itself. Ruth never left its side. She rocked it through the night, even when lightning split the sky and rain poured through the cracks in her roof. She whispered lullabies in a language no one had heard her speak before, something older, rhythmical, like waves against stone. The master tried to send word to neighboring plantations for help, but his messengers never returned. Some said they fled, others believed the swamps swallowed them whole. The air around the plantation had changed. Even travelers began to avoid the road that ran by it. Those who passed claimed they could hear a baby crying in the distance, a sound that faded as soon as they turned their heads. Inside the quarters, people began to pray differently. They called not just on God, but on the ancestors, on the river spirits, on anything that might protect them from the power they could feel creeping closer every day. By late summer, Ruth's cabin had become a forbidden place. The grass around it died, insects avoided it, and yet there were nights when a strange light glowed faintly from within, as if the air itself burned. No one dared approach, but everyone watched from afar. They said they saw shapes moving behind the windows, more than just Ruth and her baby, shifting shadows that bent the lamplight and vanished when lightning flashed. Some said they heard whispers, men's voices, women's cries, chanting that rose and fell with the wind. Others swore they saw figures walking the fields at night, barefoot and silent, their faces hidden but their steps in rhythm with the storm. Every sign pointed to what the elders had feared from the start. The ritual of the crossing had somehow found its vessel. Ruth's child was not just a symbol of pain, but a channel, a bridge between the living and the vengeful dead. The cries that killed were not meant for human ears. They were calls across the river of souls, summoning those who had suffered, binding them to the earth once more. And the more the world tried to deny it, the louder the cries grew, shaking the windows, crawling through the fields, echoing through the trees, carried on the humid Alabama wind that no prayer could calm. By the summer of 1861, the plantation no longer resembled the place it once was. The fields that had been lush and green only months before now stood half dead, the cotton brittle, the air thick with decay. The workers moved like ghosts under the burning sun, terrified to speak above a whisper. Every sound felt dangerous, every shadow seemed alive. They said the curse had sunk into the soil itself, poisoning the roots and the hearts of everyone who still dared to remain. Even the river nearby had turned darker, its water sluggish, as if the land was holding its breath. Crows circled overhead day and night, perching on the fences and chimneys, staring toward Ruth's cabin, never making a sound. It was as if they too were waiting for something to end. Ruth's baby had stopped being a child in their eyes. It had become something else entirely, a presence that no one could name. When storms approached, the clouds gathered unnaturally fast above the plantation, the wind screaming through the trees with a voice that almost sounded human. Each time lightning cracked, the baby's cry followed, not from its mouth but from the air itself, echoing through the walls, through the very bones of those who heard it. The cries came in waves, long and hollow, carrying a sound that felt like pain turned into music. After every storm, another life would be taken. Sometimes a slave would fall where he stood, his eyes wide, his hands clutching his chest. Sometimes one of the white men would be found the next morning, their faces pale, their bodies twisted, as if they had died in terror. The plantation master, Whitfield, had stopped pretending he was in control. His hair had turned almost white in a matter of weeks. He refused to leave the big house, keeping his windows shut and his shotgun within reach. The slaves said they could hear him at night pacing back and forth, muttering prayers under his breath, his voice shaking. When his wife tried to persuade him to flee to town, he refused. He said the curse would follow, that the baby's cry would find him no matter how far he went. And perhaps he was right. The sound had spread beyond the fields now. People living miles away claimed to hear faint wails drifting through the trees during storms, and travelers along the nearby roads spoke of a strange mist that followed them for miles before vanishing. The few who still dared to speak openly said the baby was no longer feeding on death, it was commanding it. The boundary between the living and the dead had worn so thin that even the air felt haunted. The slaves prayed louder, their chants growing desperate, mixing African hymns with whispered verses from the Bible, as if calling on every name of power they knew, but nothing changed. One night, an old man named Isaiah claimed that he saw figures walking through the fields, figures he recognized, men and women who had died on that land long ago, some whipped to death, some buried without names. They moved slowly through the cotton rows, their faces blank, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He said they gathered near Ruth's cabin, surrounding it, their heads bowed as if in worship or mourning. Whitfield's fear turned to madness. He sent word to Georgia for a preacher known for his fiery sermons and exorcisms, a man said to drive devils out of the possessed with his bare hands. When the preacher arrived, he came with a cross, a Bible, and a look of arrogance that made the others uneasy. He told Whitfield that no curse could withstand the power of the Lord. The next morning, the preacher went to Ruth's cabin, ignoring the warnings of everyone on the plantation. The door creaked open and he stepped inside, shouting prayers loud enough for all to hear. Those who watched from afar said the air shimmered around the cabin like heat rising from fire. Then came the cry, louder than any before. It split the air like glass breaking, and the ground shook underfoot. The preacher's voice stopped abruptly. When the door swung open hours later, they found him lying face down, his hands burned black, his Bible scorched, though no fire had touched it. His mouth was open, but no sound came from it ever again. After that, no one else tried to interfere. Whitfield fell into silence, staring from his window at the dark patch of land where the cabin stood. His wife left him within a week, taking their son and riding off before dawn. Those who remained knew they were trapped. The land was cursed, and anyone who tried to leave would never make it far. Strange lights began appearing at night along the edges of the forest, blue and flickering, dancing between the trees like spirits leading lost souls. The slaves who still worked the fields saw shadows move in patterns that no human could make, spiraling around the cotton rows like smoke caught in wind. Ruth herself was rarely seen now. Some said she no longer ate, no longer slept. Her body had grown thinner, her skin grey and ashen, but her eyes still glowed faintly, reflecting every flicker of lightning as if her soul were made of storm. The baby in her arms was silent most days, its small chest still as stone, yet the power around it pulsed stronger than ever. Those brave enough to approach the cabin said they could feel vibrations in the air as though the ground itself had a heartbeat. It was no longer a home. It was a temple of something ancient, something the living weren't meant to understand. When the wind shifted, the cries could be heard even from inside the big house. They came like waves through the night, echoing across the fields and bouncing off the trees, a reminder that there was no escape. The slaves began to say the plantation was dying, not just the crops but the spirit of the land itself. The soil had tasted too much blood, too much suffering, and now it refused to yield anything but death. Birds no longer sang at dawn, and the sun seemed dimmer every morning, as if the sky itself grieved for what had been unleashed. Those who remained prayed that the storm would end, that Ruth's child would finally grow silent forever. But each passing day only brought more thunder, more wind, more cries. It was said that if you listened closely enough, you could hear voices hidden inside the baby's wail, hundreds of them, men and women, old and young, whispering in unison from beyond the veil. The plantation was no longer bound by time or mercy. The line between life and death had been crossed, and what waited on the other side had found a way to stay. When the Civil War reached Alabama, the Whitfield plantation stood like a ghost against the horizon, its fields overgrown, its house half sunken into rot and silence. The smoke of war drifted across the countryside, but even soldiers whispered to avoid that patch of land. The locals said it was cursed, that those who entered it never returned the same. The old road that once led to the cotton fields was cracked and twisted, choked with weeds, and the once grand iron gates hung crooked on their hinges. The wind there carried no scent of flowers or life, only the thick, metallic taste of decay. When Union troops finally came through that region in the heat of 1865, they found themselves drawn toward the plantation not by strategy but by unease, as though something there called to them through the fog of war. The soldiers rode slowly, their horses uneasy beneath them. The sound of insects vanished the moment they crossed onto the property, replaced by a hollow stillness that seemed to swallow all noise. The main house stood dark, its shutters rattling in the wind, but no light burned within. The air felt colder there, the kind of chill that rose from the ground rather than fell from the sky. One of the men, a young soldier named Harris, said later that the silence was worse than any battlefield he had known. No screams, no gunfire, no life, just a waiting kind of quiet that felt alive. They dismounted and approached the house, rifles ready, boots crunching over dead grass. Inside, everything was frozen in time. The furniture still stood as it had years before, coated in dust and cobwebs. Dishes remained on the dining table, plates cracked, a cup still half filled with a dark, sticky residue that might once have been wine. The wallpaper was peeling, and the air smelled of mildew and something faintly sweet, like decaying flowers. A Bible lay open on the mantel, its pages blackened around the edges, the words blurred as if heat had licked them without leaving burn marks. The men moved cautiously through the rooms, calling out, but no answer came. In the parlor, they found footprints, small ones, leading toward the stairs, fading halfway up as though the person who made them had vanished mid-step. When they reached the upper floor, one of the men noticed strange markings carved into the walls, circles, crosses, spirals intertwined, symbols that no one recognized. They glowed faintly when the light hit them, as if something within the wood still burned. In one room, the master's study, they found a journal on the desk. The pages were filled with frantic writing, Whitfield's handwriting, uneven and desperate. The entries spoke of sleepless nights, of hearing voices in the walls, of seeing shadows that watched him as he prayed. The last entry stopped mid-sentence, the ink smeared as if by a trembling hand. From the study window, the soldiers could see Ruth's cabin still standing far across the overgrown fields, leaning to one side but untouched by the years. Everything else had fallen to ruin, yet that small cabin seemed preserved, its wood dark but whole, its door still closed tight. The men decided to investigate, though none truly wanted to go. The path there was narrow and slick with mud, the air growing heavier the closer they came. When they reached it, they noticed something strange. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. The silence pressed down on them until it hurt to breathe. The cabin door creaked as one of them pushed it open, revealing a room thick with shadows and dust. Inside was a cradle. It sat perfectly centered on the floor, clean, untouched by time. Around it, the wooden walls were marked with faint handprints, small and large, some smeared, some sharp. The air smelled faintly of earth and iron. On the floor near the cradle lay a woman's shawl, worn thin but still faintly red in places. The men looked around, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud, as if the cabin itself were hollow and endless. Then one of them, the youngest, leaned over the cradle. He expected to see nothing, maybe a doll, maybe bones. But what he saw made him stumble back and choke on his breath. Inside the cradle was a small impression, as though something invisible lay there pressing into the fabric. The blanket was indented, moving ever so slightly, like the rise and fall of breathing. The men froze, staring. Then came the sound, faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. A baby crying, soft and distant, yet echoing all around them. It wasn't coming from outside, nor from the cradle, but from everywhere at once, inside the walls, under the floor, behind their ears. The sound grew louder, sharper, piercing. The men shouted, covering their heads, their rifles clattering to the ground. The air seemed to vibrate, the walls trembling as dust fell from the ceiling. One of the men dropped to his knees, screaming that his ears were bleeding. Another fired his gun in panic, the blast deafening in the small room. The crying stopped as suddenly as it began. When the others turned to look at the man who had fired, his body was slumped against the wall, eyes open, face twisted in terror. His veins stood dark against his skin, pulsing once, before stilling forever. The remaining soldiers stumbled out of the cabin, gasping for air. Outside, the sky had turned grey, though no clouds had been there before. A faint mist rose from the ground, curling around their boots. As they mounted their horses, one of them glanced back. The cabin door was swinging slowly shut on its own, though no wind stirred. And from within came a single, drawn-out wail that followed them all the way to the edge of the property, echoing faintly in the air even after it should have faded. When they reached the next town, the surviving men refused to speak of what had happened. They told their commanding officer the plantation was empty, burned out, nothing worth salvaging. But in the weeks that followed, each of them began to dream the same dream. They saw the cabin, standing in the rain, and the sound of crying just beyond the door. Some said they woke with their ears ringing, their hearts pounding as though the cry had followed them through sleep. A few went mad. One man disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a note scrawled with trembling words. "It's still crying." Years later, the land was left to ruin. The woods grew over the fields, swallowing the fences, the barns, and the remains of the big house. The cabin still stood, its door forever closed. Travelers who passed by claimed that on stormy nights, lightning illuminated a woman's shape standing by the window, holding something small in her arms. And those brave enough to linger in the rain said they could hear it too. The faint, rhythmic sound of a baby's cry rising above the thunder, echoing across the empty fields of Alabama, a sound that no one could explain, a sound that never faded no matter how many years passed.